Hey guys, today I wanted to talk to you a bit about comfort. It's really one of the main considerations for many people when they're purchasing a bike. They're really concerned about how the bike is going to fit me, how's it going to feel, am I going to be able to ride for an extended period? And especially with electric bikes, where many people might be getting into an electric bike because they might have some mobility issues or something like that. They might feel limited, or they might feel particularly concerned about comfort, whether it be the right ride position, because maybe you have a back problem and you don't want to sit too far over, the saddle being comfortable enough. So I'm going to go into some of these different details of what really makes a bike more comfortable for a particular person, and ways that you could potentially improve a bike that you already have to make it more comfortable. So first I want to start in what's considered like the touch points of the bike, and it's really the saddle, the grips, and the pedals. So each of these can have an impact on your comfort. Now, in thinking about these details, it's important to consider what your ride position is, what you're looking to do with the bike, because if you're looking to ride more sporty, you might want to be in a more sporty position. Now, what that means really is riding in this more forward position. So right here I have a bike in front of me that's set up, and it's actually set up to put me in a relatively upright position. This bike has what's called an adjustable stem. So the stem is currently adjusted in this slightly more angled upward position. Technically it could go back even further, and the more upright I go, some people will consider that to be more comfortable, and it could be more comfortable in some ways, but it's not always necessarily better. I find it's helpful to have kind of this happy medium where I'm slightly forward but not totally forward. This helps me to have more control over the bike. If you're very upright, you have no weight on the handlebars and all your weight is here, which ultimately could cause more pressure on your backside, could cause more pressure on your back, and you really start to feel more of the bumps in the road and that sort of thing. But if you lean forward a little bit more, you're balancing your weight between the front and back, and that's really helpful. Not all bikes are going to have this adjustable style stem, but some do, and that's maybe a little bit more common these days, particularly with electric bikes. And this is an important consideration that I find I'm discussing with a lot of people, where they say, okay, well, I want to sit really upright, or I'm not really sure what sort of position I want to be in. To have some of that flexibility is really helpful. For example, actually yesterday I had to go for a ride, and I wanted to get there pretty quickly, and I was actually on a cargo bike, the load, and I was going to Costco to go pick up some groceries, and I wanted to go quickly, so I wanted to actually put the stem more forward and be in a more aerodynamic position. And I found that it did actually impact my ability to go faster. When you're sitting upright, you're kind of like a sail in the wind. But on an electric bike, it's usually not as much of a consideration, but it's still a thing. You're going to be slightly less efficient the more upright that you sit. If you look at people that ride real racing bikes, or road bikes or triathlon bikes, they're generally in this very forward position. And they do that because it's aerodynamic, and they're also getting the most amount of power into their pedals. So, I guess I talking about this, but really I think the ride position is a detail that's important to consider, and then considering these touch points. So we'll talk a bit more about the ride position in a moment, but I wanted to show you that, because as you sit more upright, when you're putting more weight on the back, you'll also generally need a saddle that can support you a little bit more. When you're riding in a more forward position, you don't need as much support in the saddle, because you're not putting as much weight there. You're balancing your weight more in between. So that's an important thing to consider. This saddle is what be considered like a moderate style, so it's not super wide. I generally put saddles in 3 different categories: sporty, moderate, and then relaxed. Actually, to some extent, this comes from this company, Cell Royale, who we work with a lot. This would be considered more of a sporty saddle. It's going to be a little bit narrower here in the rear. This is kind of in the middle, but this is a bit more sporty. And then you kind of move up from here. This is something more moderate, and then this is very relaxed. So this style saddle you'd want if you're sitting very upright. You're going to limit some of your mobility and your ability to pedal the bike efficiently. You limit that a little bit by sitting very upright, but it's kind of a trade-off. And as I said, with an electric bike, you can afford to take some of those concessions that you might not otherwise take. Now, one thing to consider is that some bikes, they might come and you might be set up in a more sporty position. By default, many bikes, especially bikes that are made by US companies, because in the States, we're just so really stuck in this mindset that bikes are for sport, and I find that a lot of companies have challenges getting outside of that mindset. I think that especially with electric bikes, there's an opportunity to kind of rethink that, and especially when you're thinking about a bike for more utility, you might as well be a bit more comfortable. We were recently in the Netherlands, and if you see there, everybody rides in this upright seating position. Now, they generally don't go as fast as somebody might go on a road bike or something like that, but you can tell they're very comfortable. And one of the details that they talk about a lot, and you might not necessarily think about, is when you're sitting in this upright position, you have better visibility. So you have better mobility of your head, so you're able to look around much easier. When you're sitting down like this, you kind of get like limited to like how far you can see side to side. So when riding in an urban environment, that's an important factor. So most of the bikes that we sell, or what we generally direct people towards, is maybe especially if you're riding in an urban environment, to sit a bit more upright. It's pretty helpful for that. So that's the saddles, and everybody's different. Now, one of the details to consider in relation to a saddle is that there's different sizes, and the sizes are based on the width of your sit bone. Now, these more relaxed saddles, you might not find that they go into those sizes so much because they're already so wide. But when you're looking at a more sporty saddle, you're generally going to have two sizes, like a small and a large, something like that. And what you'll want to do is measure your sit bone to figure out what size you actually need. So we're able to do that in the shop. There's different ways to do it at home. One of the ways you can do it is with like a piece of cardboard or something that actually will like make some indentation. You could sit on it and you can actually see your bones kind of come through, and then you can measure the distance between that indentation. And based on that measurement, you can decide on what your saddle size is. So that's saddles, certainly important. Handlebars, I don't have any to show here, but I'll show you on some different bikes. Like this one has a bit of a rise and a bit of a sweep. By giving the rise and the slight sweep, it's going to put you a little bit more upright. If you have a flat bar, which you might find more commonly on a mountain bike or a bike that's made to be a bit more sporty, it's going to put you in a more forward position. You'll also notice on this particular bike, the bars are pretty wide. Going wider will also put you in a more forward position, but it also improves your ability to handle the bike. So when you have a wide bar, you have more leverage. It's kind of, you think of this like this bar is a lever. So the further out you go, if just slight pulling on it, you actually get more of that mechanical advantage. Now you can cut down bars to go a little bit narrower. That will actually pull you a little bit more upright, because if you look, like say if my bars are here, I can sit here, but if I spread this out, I might be pushing myself a bit more forward. But generally speaking, you don't want the bars too much wider than your shoulders. I mean, on some mountain bikes, it's more common. There's more of a trend to go in that direction. But if you go very wide, generally people are a little bit more comfortable. You might also limit your mobility going through kind of tighter spaces. But you don't want to go too narrow, because then you really limit your ability to control the bike, and that's definitely an important consideration. But I wanted to show you, while we're over here, these grips. So these are grips made by a company called Ergon. We primarily work with Ergon because they have this ergonomic shape to them. I find it really improves the comfort of the grip, and it really improves, well, I'd say it really lessens the pain that I generally experience and many people often experience when holding onto a grip for an extended period. So on a standard round grip, when you don't have this extra part on it, basically what it does is a standard round grip just kind of cuts off the circulation in your hand, especially if you're putting a lot of pressure there and your hands could feel like they're going a bit numb. That could also happen if you're leaning forward too much, if you're not balanced on the bike properly. And so having this really helps to spread the pressure out. So instead of just cutting straight across, you're spreading that pressure out across the palm of your hand. And I find that really improves the comfort. And I very rarely ever get, I actually practically never get any pain when I'm holding onto a grip like this. One thing I want to go back to in thinking about pain, most people, when they think about that, they think about pain in my back because they're ride position. Maybe they're, feel like they're bending too far forward, and that might just be that the bike's not sized correctly for you. But another thing that a lot of people come to me and they say, well, normally when I ride on a bike, I get pain, in my backside when I'm on the saddle, and their natural inclination is to say, I want a softer saddle. I want something with more foam. And that might be good for the short term, but actually longer term, having a very soft saddle, what ends up happening is when you sit on it for a very extended period, the foam just ends up compressing, and then you end up having no support. So if you look at many saddles, particularly on bikes that people ride for longer distances, a lot of times they actually don't have that much foam, or it's really thin, and generally it's firmer. Now, if you're just getting back into riding, it might be helpful to start with a softer saddle, but as you get into it more and you want to ride longer distances, you might want to consider going with something a bit firmer, because that's going to help to provide support for a longer period. Another detail to consider in the way that the saddle works, it's not all just about this foam. Part of the saddle also works kind of like a hammock in some ways. You have these metal support bars, and there should be some level of flex between the actual frame of the saddle, which that's actually where you're getting some comfort. So you have the foam, which is flexing on here, but also the frame of the saddle will provide some flex, and that'll actually improve the comfort there. We could think about the seat posts. Now, many bikes come with a standard seat post, which is rigid. There's no suspension. This particular bike has a suspension seat post. This one is called the Cane Creek Thud Buster, and the idea is that there's a rubber elastomer here, and it flexes. So as you go over bumps, it absorbs some of the bumps as you sit on it. Now, there's other types of suspension seat posts. Here's another style that actually uses springs. Now, this one, you change the springs depending on your body weight. This is called the Connect seat post. Previously, it was called the Body Float. You change the springs depending on your weight, and then you can adjust the preload here, and you can really fine tune it. So that really works quite well, and I find in the world of suspension seat posts, this is really one of the best in my experience, or I'd say actually the best, but the challenge is that these things cost money. I mean, this one's about $250, where the Thud Buster is about $150. But if you're riding often, particularly if you're riding in rougher terrain, like for example, New York, the roads are really rough, and I find that having this Connect seat post, many people, it's just a no-brainer. The value is definitely there. Now, this is a hardtail bike, meaning that it doesn't have rear suspension, so adding the seat post suspension definitely improves things quite a bit. But you could also go for a bike with rear suspension. Now, we offer many bikes like that, and many bikes that actually have rear suspension, and they're made for the street. There are several models specifically from Reese & Mueller, and more brands are kind of moving in that direction, where they're taking this concept, which originally was really designed for mountain bikes, and taking it to the street, which I should mention that a lot of what I'm talking about is oriented towards that. A lot of the bikes that we sell are oriented towards the street, commuting, cargo bikes, different things like that. So having rear suspension is one way definitely to improve comfort, but also to improve the stability and traction on the bike as well. So we see many people going in that direction. Now, one of the other things that's really important, aside from ride position, grips, saddle, is the tires on the bike. Now, generally speaking, the width of your tire will have a lot to do with how much of the road it absorbs. Now, we have a lot of bikes, actually, probably our most common tire size is 2.4 inches wide. Now, this bike actually has one of these 2.4 inch wide tires. So this is called the Schwabe Supermoto X, and it's pretty wide. I mean, especially if you compare it to a road bike tire, which might be as small as a half an inch, or probably a little bit more for most uses. But to go to this size, it might be like, well, that's going to be very inefficient. Why should I consider it's going to be heavier? But with the electric bike, it's really not as big of a deal. So from my perspective, I generally would go in the direction of having as wide of tire as the bike can handle. Many manufacturers are still going in the direction of keeping a relatively narrow tire, and now we're even seeing some electric road bikes and things like that. But really, in thinking about comfort, having a wider tire generally is going to bring you more comfort. Especially, one of the things you have a lot of flexibility with is you can adjust your tire pressure. So if you put a lower pressure on the tire, it's going to give you more comfort. It's going to be less efficient, but it's going to definitely be more comfortable. So that's one of the things that you can play with, especially if you don't have a bike with full suspension. You can adjust the tire pressure, and that could kind of act as a suspension in some ways. Now, one of the last details I want to cover over here before we look at some of the different bike designs and handlebars and stuff like that is pedals. So most bikes that we sell kind of come with a standard smaller size pedal like this. But one of the things that people might not feel as comfortable on that because you don't have as much of a platform to put your foot on, so you're not getting as much support. Now, this has some added comfort and traction with this rubber here, but I generally find I appreciate having this wider pedal. It spreads the pressure out across my foot. Now, one detail to consider in relation to this also is that you're going to want to have a shoe which is going to provide good support. I actually had somebody who was in the shop test riding on Saturday, and she was wearing like a very lightweight shoe. It's almost like a ballet slipper style, like slip-on shoe. And that really doesn't provide much support at all. So you're kind of like riding a bike almost barefoot. But you want to have a good amount of support on that shoe. And also, if it has a relatively firm sole, that's really helpful. Because what I find, if I'm riding with a shoe that doesn't have a firm sole to it, having that flex, I end up like stretching my foot out a little bit, and sometimes I can experience pain or strain in my foot from not having enough support there. So I generally wear like a skateboarding style shoe. There's many shoes which are made specifically for biking. I find a lot of them look a little bit goofy, but you know, some people don't care about that. I'm a little bit sensitive on that, but you know, it's something to consider. So generally, I recommend going in this direction of having a wider sort of platform pedal. But one of the things to think about with this is that these have these spikes on them because they're really intended for more mountain biking. And this could, if you kind of catch your leg on this or something like that, that definitely could hurt. So something to be mindful of. Another pedal that I want to show here is it's kind of a similar sort of platform pedal, but it has this like kind of sandpaper on it. I'm finding this design is becoming a bit more popular, especially for urban riding, and it offers a bit more support than some of the other style pedals, offers a good amount of grip, and if you slip off the pedal, you don't have that tendency to maybe hurt your leg or something like that. But personally, I'm kind of more into the mountain bike style pedal, but for a lot of people, I think this style can make a lot of sense, especially for urban applications. Now, I talked a bit about the handlebars and the ride position. We talked about suspension, but I really wanted to go into this handlebar position thing because I think it's really important. Now, this bike is a mountain bike, and it's got relatively flat bars. They have a slight rise and sweep to them, and you might find some mountain bikes are even more aggressive in that regard. And this stem is straight and short, so it's going to put you in that forward position. Now the thing is, if I'm riding more aggressive mountain bike trails and I'm very upright, I really don't have as much control over the bike, so it's really not so ideal. I might also have challenges controlling the bike and climbing. So climbing, you might want to balance a bit more. If you don't have any weight on your front wheel, you're going to tend to want to lift up the front wheel as you're riding. So this bike is considered pretty sporty in that regard. I mean, one of the things, this particular brand, Riese Mueller, their mountain bike is a little bit more relaxed in general, but still certainly more sporty than the average kind of city bike. But the interesting thing about this is that this bike is a mountain bike, but actually they have bikes which are oriented to the street using the same exact frame. And basically what happens is they change the handlebar, stem, and usually there's a saddle in conjunction with that. I'm going to show you another version of this bike that just has some slight changes to that. So I'll just pull this over here. Now this is called the Super Delight, basically the same frame, but it has two batteries. But if you see, the stem is adjusted way back. So if I sit on this bike, I'm going to sit pretty upright. One other detail you might notice is these grips. They have this extra horn on here. This is called the GP3. They have a GP2, which has a smaller one, and then they have even a GP5, which kind of comes way up here, gives you another position to put your hands. But the stem, it's pulled back. It's going to give you an upright seating position. So effectively the same bike, same frame, more or less, and you have a totally different ride position and experience. Now this bike is set up to be that on-off-road style, has the somewhat off-road style tires on it, but it's also possible to get it more in this street tire, similar to the tires that I showed you before. But it really depends on what you're looking to do with it. But I think it's important to consider that, maybe just because the bike is in that more sporty position doesn't mean that you can't necessarily change that. The one thing to consider, though, is that some bikes, really the geometry of the bike is set up in such a way that it's really not designed to sit more upright. Now, Riese Mueller specifically, they consider that when they make these bikes with adjustable stem and that sort of thing, they might have certain geometry changes that make the bike more adjustable in that way. So it's important to consider if you take a bike that's intended to be very sporty and you want to sit more upright, it might not be as ideal, but it certainly could improve your comfort, but it's just important to consider that the handling might be impacted. So part of the reason I'll mention this is, one, it's really great that these bikes are available with these different adjustments, but we can also make adjustments in the shops. I mean, other shops can do that as well, but it's a common thing. It's more common, you probably find, with road bikes and mountain bikes where people are riding for sport. It's also more critical because this is one detail that I think is important to consider. When you're sitting in this very forward position, these slight adjustments to your ride position can make a dramatic difference in how you feel and you experience the bike. If you're feeling kind of stretched out, that slight half an inch forward might feel, you're stretching in areas that you wouldn't normally want to stretch out. But when you're sitting more upright, these slight adjustments, it's not going to impact you as much. But still something to consider. So these bars are from this company Ergotech. This is primarily who we work with for aftermarket handlebars and stems, and the reason being is that they have this safety level. So this is safety level 6. We primarily just work with safety level 5 and 6, which are made specifically for electric bikes. Safety 6 is the highest level, so it's made for fast bikes or mountain bikes, specifically electric. So these handlebars have a rise and a sweep to them. So if you put these on a bike that had a relatively flat bar, this is going to get you to be a little bit more upright. Now, some other changes you can make is a stem. You know, we were looking at this mountain bike before with the relatively straight and flat stem. But if I was to take this stem and put it here, that's going to change the ride position pretty dramatically. I mean, this one's quite long, but there are shorter versions of it as well. Again, this is safety level 5, which actually for a mountain bike, depending, this might not be so recommended for riding like more aggressive trails. But also, as I said, you probably are not going to want to be in that position if you are riding on more aggressive trails. But you can see this is actually the same style stem. I believe this model is called the Charisma, and just a shorter length there. So depending if you're going to be, you know, more forward or you know, more back that way. And then yeah, I just wanted to show one other bar. This is not as common, but this is what's called a riser bar. So it has a really high rise to it. It's actually 70 millimeters, and that's 70 millimeters from here to here. So it really gives that high rise. You find this style bar more on, like, it's almost like a motor cross style bar. But this might be helpful in certain scenarios where you might not want as much of a sweep, but you just want to be a bit more upright. So you still want to be forward, but you want to be more upright. So there's all these sort of things. If you have questions about it, just reach out to us, or just, you know, leave them in the comments below. I'll try to help the best that I can. You know, it's kind of challenging to do some of this stuff, you know, without connecting with somebody. But one thing that we actually do quite a bit in the shop is, you know, take people's measurements and kind of fit them to the specific bike, and sometimes even when they're not in the shop. So if you need help with that, you can reach out to us, and we'll do our best to help. You know, we generally just work with our customers in that regard, as you could probably imagine, because some of it could be a bit time consuming, but not for the person, you know, writing or calling in, but just on our side, figuring out what's going to actually work for somebody. You know, as I said before, I mean, the nice thing is, as you're sitting more upright, these measurements or details are not as critical as it is if you're riding a very sporty bike, like a road bike, you know, where that extra ½ inch of going forward might mean just a total different change in the way the bike rides. But for example, if the bars are coming back just another ½ inch or going up another ½ inch, generally speaking, that's not going to have as much of an impact on you. So, important things to consider. I hope you guys found this to be helpful. If you have any questions, just reach out as always. I'm always happy to help. And I look forward to seeing you in a future video. All right? Enjoy.